So again, good evening everybody. For this evening, the PMI evening, this is the 6th of this year of the PMI South. And we are having the opportunity, the honor, I would say, to have David Hillson, the risk doctor, that is one authority on risk management internationally recognized. And he has a lot of awards from the PMI for several associations. He has contributing and contributes to the body of knowledge and also to the risk management section of the body of knowledge, in particular co-authoring this portion. So before we start, for those PMP that would like to claim the PDUs, the code for this evening is 150916, and on the table at the entrance there is this sheet that if you want to have a record of this number for claiming the PDU. Having said that, I leave the floor to David, and I thank him again for having accepted to come and to present. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Franco. Please. So good evening, everybody. Isn't it embarrassing when a risk specialist arrives late? So where was the contingency? Where was the backup plan? And how come you allowed this to happen? And blah, 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 blah. Yes, I know all that. So I've been here for 30 minutes, driving round and round. I've been here to this building several times before. I know exactly where it is, and then I just didn't know about the roadworks. So in the end, I parked in the square and I've walked along. And then I asked the lady at reception, so where is the meeting? She says, what meeting? I said, the PMI meeting. No, doesn't know anything about it. So I've actually been in the building for now 15 minutes without actually arriving here. So I do have excuses, but I still apologise for starting late. That's obviously not what we normally would expect. What I want to do this evening is to give you some insights into how we deal with very risky projects. And I know that some of you here from E&I are involved in particularly risky projects, and others are as well. In fact, all projects are risky, because the only projects that are worth doing are those where we're not quite sure what's going to happen, but we take risk on behalf of our clients and our shareholders and stakeholders in order to generate benefits, value, and reward. And the higher the risk, the higher the reward. If we always play it safe, then in fact we don't have the opportunity to create very much value. So risky projects are interesting projects, and that means that the way that we manage risk on projects is really, really important. In fact, in my view, there is a direct positive correlation between our ability to manage risk and our chances of success. So the better we are at risk management, the more we have successful projects, successful businesses, comfortable lives, profit, margin, bonuses, all of those good things. So for me, this is not just another part of the PMI body of knowledge, another kind of technical skill area. For me, managing risk is a life skill. It's something that we really need to understand and be able to do well if we want to succeed in meeting our objectives. So I've been involved in risk management for, well, actually 30 years. I started in 1984 when I was about 6. And that's a joke, by the way. But I've been doing it for a very long time, and I'm still involved for 2 reasons. One is that it works. It actually helps us to make sure that we achieve our goals more frequently and with less hassle along the way. But the other reason I'm involved in risk management still is because it's changing and developing, because we're still learning how to do it better. And I have the privilege of being in a thought leadership position of being able to develop some new ideas and share those with the community through PMI, through APM, through the Institute of Risk Management and other formats. But I'm not just interested in thought leadership, I'm interested in practical application. If these things don't work, then what's the point? So what we do in the Risk Doctor Partnership is we develop new ideas that work in practice. And it's not just kind of blue sky academic thinking. We're not academics at all, we are actually practitioners. And so, as Franco said, I'm the vice chairman of the update project for the PMBOK guide. We're producing the 6th edition right now. We have a draft which is just going for expert review next week, and then it'll come out for everybody else to see later on in the year. So I'm the vice chairman of that project, and then with particular responsibility, amongst other things, for the risk chapter. And so some of these new ideas are finding their way into the risk chapter of the PMBOK guide. And so it's important that we understand where the latest thinking is going and to make sure that our practice follows behind that. And all of this is to help us manage risk more effectively. Now, I'm known as the Risk Doctor. We have a company called the Risk Doctor Partnership, which is about 24 people around the world. We have staff in Australia and South Africa and the States and Canada, South America, right through Europe and so on. And what we do is we help people understand and manage risk wherever they encounter it. All we do is to do with risk management, not just in projects and programs, but also in other settings, so financial risk, environmental risk, reputation risk, counter-terrorism, security, all of those sorts of interested fraud, and so on. So we are risk management specialists. And what we do is we try and sort of move things forward, as I say. But my particular role as the risk doctor is to lead the partnership into leading edge practice that's going to work for us and for our clients. And as the risk doctor, it's an interesting title, but I use it because it helps us to think about things like consulting, obviously, about trusted professionals, about experts that you go to when you have a problem because you expect them to help you to solve the problem. And what we've done recently is to use that idea of a medical metaphor to explore and explain some of the major problems that people have in managing risk on their projects, programs, and businesses. And I published a book. I publish a thought leadership book every year. So my 10th book came out last year. It's called The Risk Doctor's Cures for Common Risk Ailments. And I've got a few copies which I'm making available this evening, and there's also a leaflet which gives you a 30% discount if you wanted to buy a copy. But the idea of the book is to use a medical metaphor to say, let's use the idea of a real ailment as a way into understanding something about a risk management ailment, a risk management problem. And then we can diagnose it and we can look at, in fact, I've got some slides here. We're going to look at a particular risk ailment, but we're going to go for prognosis, diagnosis, and treatment. So prognosis means where will it take you if you don't do anything about it? Diagnosis, how do you know you've got it? And treatment, what can you do about it? And that's the concept behind this book. It's a serious risk management book, but it just takes that slightly innovative lens on addressing these 10 problems. And I recommend you take a look. So what we're going to look at specifically this evening is a particular risk ailment, an issue that people have in terms of managing risky projects, which we call risk obesity. And I'll obviously need to explain what that is and how that helps us to understand a particular risk management problem. And then we'll follow through this structure of prognosis, diagnosis, and treatment options. What I want you to do after this presentation is to understand what makes us take too much risk on our projects. And once we understand that, to recognize how would you know if you had too much risk on one of your projects? And then, perhaps most important, what can you do about it? What sort of strategies have we got that will help us to address a too risky project if we find that we've got one? And lastly, to then use that information to be what we call risk healthy, and we'll come to that towards the end of the presentation. So I plan to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes and then make some time for questions afterwards. I will say I speak often. I was speaking yesterday at a conference up in London, the oil and gas sector, Advanced Risk Management 2-day conference. This is the first time I've ever spoken on this subject. So this is a world premiere, which means that I've no idea what I'm going to say, and hopefully it'll be fine. So, analogy. What's analogy? This is a joke. Analogy is not about rashes and spots and sneezes and having to take antihistamines. Analogy is a word that we use when we compare two things that are different in order to understand what they really are. So you take something which is like something and you say this is like that, and if it's a good analogy, then we can use the thing that we're comparing it with to understand the thing that we're interested in. So something like this, the atomic structure is like a solar system. It isn't a solar system, but the nucleus is like the sun, and then the atoms, the electrons and the neutrons going around and around on the outside, not neutrons, the electrons going around the outside are like a solar system. It's a picture that helps us understand what atomic structure is like. Now, life is a rat race. It isn't really. It actually feels like that, but that tells you something about, the sort of the stresses and strains that we're under. You might know this little poem. Her eyes were limpid pools full of barnacles. Her teeth were like stars They came out at night. Her ears were like flowers, cauliflowers. Her hair was like waves on the sea, the Dead Sea. I mean, I'm sure you know how this goes. It's a picture, and we could use it to help us understand. You can laugh at my jokes, by the way. If you don't laugh at my jokes, I tell worse jokes until you actually laugh. So, analogy. We're going to use the idea of the physical problem of obesity as an analogy to understand risk obesity, which we're defining as taking too much risk in our projects. And we'll come to that. And by using a real issue, a real medical ailment, as a picture, I absolutely don't intend to belittle or to make fun of or to trivialize the real medical ailment. These are, all 10 of them in the book are real issues that people really struggle with, and I'm just using it as a picture to help us understand something about the problems we have with risk management. So it's in no way sort of trying to get at this particular problem or make any comment about it, but we're using it as a picture. So what is obesity? Obesity is an accumulation of excess body fat which affects you in a bad way. And in fact, it can affect you so badly that it could actually be terminal. It can reduce your life expectancy. It increases the likelihood of you getting other problems, other medical problems. So heart disease, coronary heart disease, strokes and so on. You're familiar with the idea of type 2 diabetes being caused by obesity, arthritis, joint problems, skin problems, all sorts of things that you're susceptible to if you have a problem with obesity. And where does it come from? There's a whole range of different things that can cause or result in obesity. Obviously, one of the main things is the amount of calories that you take in compared to the calories that you use. But it's not just calorific or food intake. It's also to do with not necessarily exercising enough. And then some people might have a genetic susceptibility in their genes. Their DNA actually gives them a problem. And then there are other diseases that can lead to the physical problem of obesity. So as a picture, we're going to say, well, what does that tell us about risk obesity? What causes it? If physical obesity is an accumulation of excess body fat, which can lead to reduced life expectancy, then we're going to define risk obesity as an accumulation of excess risk. And for this evening, we're going to look at projects. We could also look at businesses or in our personal lives or in other settings. But it's too much risk in our projects. And it matters because it threatens the overall health of the project and can actually be terminal in the worst case. Like physical obesity makes you more susceptible to other problems, so does risk obesity. Having too much risk in our projects means that we can lack resilience when things change, and we'll talk about this when we come to some of these prognosis, the things that it will lead to. So if you're in a dynamic, changing environment and you have too much risk in your project, it slows you down. You can't react. You're not flexible because you're overburdened with too much risk in your project. And there's a number of different things that causes it. Obviously, it's about taking on too much risk. So we have the idea of risk appetite, which is a desire to take risk. And if you have an uncontrolled risk appetite, you'll take on more risk than you should, clearly. But it's also perhaps affected by our organizational genes, by our culture, by the ethos of our organizations, some of which push us to take more and more and more risk because of the associated reward or because of the competitive environment that we're in. So it's not all necessarily down to the project itself. Sometimes it is to do with the environment or the culture that our projects exist in. So you'll see that there's some parallels between physical obesity and risk obesity. Physical obesity, too much fat, too much weight because of uncontrolled appetite, taking in too much food, not enough exercise, and so on. Risk obesity, too much risk in our projects, making us inflexible and unable to cope with change, caused by an uncontrolled risk appetite and perhaps influenced also by the organizational culture. That's the picture. And obesity, physical obesity is a real problem. This is some data from the World Health Organization with kind of percentage rates of obesity in organizations. This was in 2014. And it's color-coded. In the UK, we're here, which is sort of 25% of the population currently suffering from some level of obesity, and obesity as opposed to being overweight. And you can see the hot spots here. In terms of the actual numbers, nearly a third of the world's population are overweight. Within that, there's something like 13% are obese. So we've got more than 500,000 people worldwide are suffering from obesity. And in the last 35 years, the number of cases have more than doubled. And just here's the example from the States as an example. And it's not just in rich countries, in developed countries, it's also in developing countries because of the types of calories that are available to them and the increase in middle classes and so on in places like China and India, which is leading them to adopt Western eating habits without necessarily the other lifestyle that goes with it. So it is a real problem. And it affects our children, so that our children have issues also with having strange sort of body images, and they're afraid of putting on weight, and it can lead to anorexia and bulimia and other real problems for our children. You're not laughing at my jokes. It's going to get worse if you don't. So now, what about risk obesity? Okay, we all know there's an obesity problem, and I guess we all watch our waistline in some way. But what about the amount of risk we take on our projects? Is that a real problem? Is it an issue? Well, certainly there's a problem with project performance. Here is the data for the well-known Standish Group's CHAOS study, looking at how projects perform over the last 20 years. The most recent data, there is another set of data, but it's not publicly available yet, shows that a fifth of projects outright fail. That means they meet none of their objectives, or they're cancelled. It's just a disaster. Nearly half of the projects are challenged. That means one major objective is not delivered, at least one. And then we've only got just about a third that actually succeed. This is not good. And if you look at the data across the chart, you'll see it really hasn't improved over all of that time. It's just we've got a real problem with project delivery. And there are loads and loads of examples. Here is just a few really well-known ones where I've picked out being late and over budget. Yes, wow, exactly. And some of these, are they successful or are they not? Well, certainly in project management terms, they were so late and so overspent. There's something clearly has gone majorly wrong with these projects. And these are just the kind of poster child examples. We've all got our own examples, unfortunately, of projects that we've worked on which have just been out of control and have ended up really having problems. Why does it matter if we take on more risk than we can cope with in our projects? The prognosis is saying this is where it's going to take you if you've got this problem, if you don't deal with it. That's what prognosis means, looking forward. So here are some things that you might find in your projects if you're carrying more risk than you can properly cope with, than you can deal with. So things like if more risk comes along, you're sunk. You can't take on any more because you're fully loaded with the amount of risk that you can cope with. As I said before, being inflexible. So the situation changes, new risks arise, and you're already overburdened, stressed out with coping with so many risks on your project that you can't think about another one. Everybody's in crisis mode, firefighting, which makes the team stressed, leading to a level of mistakes that perhaps could have been avoided. That leads to reduced morale, reduced productivity, poor decision making, and so on. And we end up with a systemic failure that could end up with the project being shut down if these things are allowed to continue. So taking on too much risk, if we get these sorts of issues, could be terminal for your project. And clearly it matters. So what we need to do is make sure that we don't take on too much risk. So how do you know if you've got too much risk? Clearly risk obesity means there's too much risk in the project, but what does that mean? How do we decide if we're taking on more risk than we can address effectively? And this is a really key question for project managers, project sponsors, project owners, business owners, anybody who's responsible for delivering projects. How much risk is too much risk on your project? And how do you know? It's a really important question. It's a worrying question. You kind of might have a gut feel, this is a really risky project and I'm not comfortable, but how do you know if it's too much? Well, if we think about it, there are two things that we need to know. First of all, how much risk is appropriate, which we define through our risk appetite. How much risk do we want to take on this project? And then how much risk have we actually got? That's our risk exposure. And then we can compare what we've got with what we should have. And clearly, if the exposure is above the appetite, we've got too much risk. But then we need to be able to measure these things. We need to be able to define risk appetite in measurable terms and be able to measure our risk exposure in the same terms. So do we know how to do that? Do you know how to do that on your project? Does anybody know how to do it on your project? Because without those two things that we can measure, define the risk appetite, measure the risk exposure and compare the two, we don't know if we've got too much risk. We just have this kind of feeling, you know, it's a bit heavy, it's a bit stodgy, it's a bit inflexible, it shouldn't be like this. But is it really? This is the problem that we need to address. Now, how do we do this in the world of projects? How do we answer these two questions? We do have a kind of a tool which is supposed to help us, and it's defined in the PMBOK guide and in other guides. The PI matrix, the probability impact matrix, is supposed to illustrate the risk appetite and allow us to indicate our risk exposure. Now, you know what a PI matrix is. A risk is an uncertainty that matters. It's an uncertain event, or let's quote the PMBOK, an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on achieving project objectives. So we could say an uncertain event or condition, the question is how uncertain, and we measure how uncertain it is in terms of probability or likelihood, you might call it. And then we've got an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has an effect on objectives. We could call that impact. So we've got two dimensions of risk to decide how big a risk is, how likely is it to happen, and what will it do to us. And we can use those two dimensions to define how much risk we want to take and how much risk we've actually got. And so the PI matrix is a kind of traffic light system, red, yellow, and green. You'll see this in the PMBOK guide in chapter 11, I think it's figure 11.6 or somewhere around there, which says we've got here two dimensions. We've got a probability impact in the vertical. Of course, this doesn't work on this kind of screen. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so probability goes up and impact goes across. A risk could be positive or negative. Risks include threats as well as opportunities. I hope you're happy with that idea. So we've got negative impact for threats, positive impact for opportunities. And with this double-sided grid, it's conventional to flip over the opportunity side. So we've got low to high for threats on this side and then high to low for opportunities on this side. And what that does is it creates a picture like this, which we might call a mirror matrix. Some people call it the butterfly matrix because it kind of looks like that. But the reason we do it like this is because it creates a focus in the middle with this combined red zone which contains the worst threats and the best opportunities. High probability, high impact, bad things, oh dear, and high probability, really good impact, positive things, oh great. So this, we focus in the red zone. And the idea of the traffic lights, red, yellow, green, red means stop. Anything in there you need to stop and look at. You can't just carry on if there's a really bad threat or a fabulous opportunity. We need to stop and look at these. Right? Familiar with this? Green means go. If you've got a low priority opportunity, probably won't happen, doesn't help very much. Or a low priority threat, probably won't happen, isn't too bad. Then we leave those till last. We can just carry on. So we've got this idea of using this to prioritize our risks. Now, the positioning of the red, yellow, green zones defines our risk appetite. So when we say this is a red risk in this area, then that means it's too much risk. It's too much uncertainty that matters that we need to stop and deal with. Green zone, acceptable, that's fine. Yellow zone is on the borderline. So our risk appetite on a project is defined by the position of the red, yellow, green zones on our probability impact matrix. Then we take each risk and we say, okay, say it's a threat, how likely is it to happen? The probability is low. What's the impact going to be? The impact is very high. It's in the red zone. Then we plot it to here. It's a high priority threat. If we have an opportunity, the probability of it occurring is medium. The impact is low. It plots to here and it's just a green. It's a low priority opportunity. So what we do is we take the risks and we plot them. We use the grid to assess them, plot them onto the grid, and then we see where the distribution is between red, yellow, and green, urgent, medium priority, low priority. Okay? All standard stuff. So how do you know you've got a high-risk project? Well, you'll have lots of red risks, obviously. There are a lot of things that are very uncertain with very big impacts. So how do you know where red is? Well, you know, how would we define that? This picture you'll see in the PMBOK guide, but is it the same for every project? Could the red zone be bigger or smaller depending on how much risk we want to take on a project? If we wanted to take lots of risk, then maybe we should take lots of risks, we take fewer risks, as urgent. So the red zone will be smaller on a project where we wanted to take more risk. The green zone will be bigger if we want to take more risk because more risks are treated as low priority, right? If we want to take less risk, then we expand the red zone, so more things are treated as urgent because we don't want to take so much risk. So the size of the zones can change depending on our risk appetite. How much risk do we want to take? So one question then is, how are we going to define that? And who decides? So it's all very well for me to say, yes, I've got a threat with a low probability of a very high impact, but what does that actually mean? If I say those words, you have no idea what I'm really thinking. When I say threat, let's say a threat to the budget, and so it's a bad thing, has a low probability of a high impact. Let's just put some numbers on that. What probability is associated with a low probability of occurrence? You might say 1 in 10. I was thinking 1 in a million. And then it's got a very high impact on the project budget. Let's put some dollars or euros or pounds onto that. How many dollars is a very high cost impact? You might say 1 million. I was thinking 1 billion. Why was I saying this is a 1 in a million chance of $1 billion impact? Because I'm going to put a man on Mars. That's my project. And so in the context of that project, these terms mean something different than if we're in Mozambique or if we're moving from one office to another. So we have to define these terms. And it's a problem. How are we going to do that? How do we define our thresholds and our zones? With probability, it's probably quite easy. Probability is a linear scale. It's not 0 because there's no uncertainty with 0 probability. It can't happen. It's not 100 because there's no uncertainty with 100% probability. It will happen. So the uncertainty is in the middle. And we could just sort of slice that up into linear slots and say this is what we mean by high, medium, and low for probability. That's easy. Impact is not so easy. Impact is going to be different. We need to think about it for our budget, for our timeline, for our reputation, for safety, for performance, for technical performance, for lots of different things that a risk could impact, either bad or good, threats or opportunities. So we need to define our impact scales for each objective. And it needs to be project specific because whether we're putting a man on Mars or moving office, those scales are going to be completely different. So how do we do it? The PMBOK guide and the ISO standard, all these other places say do it. Nobody tells you how. Well, here's a suggestion. My suggestion is that for threats, we start with the worst case impacts, the very high impact, and we say, for a very high impact, what kind of impact on an objective would be completely intolerable? If this happens, we're absolutely messed up. It's a disaster. This is an oh bother, an oh no risk. Can't happen. So this defines the completely unacceptable. Then we can look at the bottom of the range. What does very low mean? A very low level of impact means we don't care. We're $1 overspent, $10, $100, $1,000. It really doesn't matter. Somewhere, someone notices. And on each project, the point at which you notice a dollar impact is different. One of my daughters got married, and a £1,000 impact would have been actually quite noticeable for me because it came out of my pocket, not some project sponsor. I was the project sponsor. So, for us, our cost impacts on my daughter's wedding were quite small because it's my money. And so £1,000 was, really? You really want that dress? Can we not have this dress and shoes with handmade crystals? Are you sure you want to do that? It was wonderful. So you get the disaster at the top, the kind of we don't really care at the bottom, and then you spread the other points in between. That's how we can do it. And here what we're doing is we're saying how much risk is too much risk on a graded scale. That's quite interesting. We could do exactly the same for opportunities. A very high impact for an opportunity is a benefit, a saving, which is so good that we can't afford to miss it. It's just must have. And then we've got the kind of the bottom level, you save £1 or you save a day, it doesn't really matter, and we spread the other points in between. Generally, when people start, these two scales are set to be the same, just inverted, positive, negative, because effectively, one of the things in terms of managing opportunities to remember is that an opportunity is the same as a threat in risk terms. The only difference is the sign of the impact. So opportunities are positive, threats are negative, but apart from that, they're the same. So that's how we can manage them through the same process. So here's a kind of a thinking process that we can go through to define what we mean by high, medium, and low. And then we would use agreed combinations of high probability, low impact, medium probability, high impact, and so on to define where these zones are. Okay? So here's an example, and this is an example from a real project, but it's only an example because every project is different. So we've got a 5-point scale, very low to very high, and we're just going to slice up the probability range to say on this project, low means 11 to 30 and high means 50 to 70, say. So that's quite easy. When it comes to the impact side, what we've got to do is define these high, medium, and low terms for each objective. So in this example, we're doing time, cost, and performance. It could be regulatory compliance, it could be safety, it could be other objectives, depending on your project. So what we do is we follow that process that I showed you. Very high for a threat is intolerable, very low is insignificant. For an opportunity, very high is must have, very low is we don't care, and we spread the other points in between. And here's an example of what it could look like, and in fact it did look like on one of my projects, that a threat which resulted in more than 3 months delay, we cancelled the project. If the budget was over $5 million over the budget, I got sacked. If it didn't work, what's the point in delivering it? These are intolerable levels of impact. Down here, a couple of days late, nobody noticed. 10, 20, 30K in this project budget didn't matter. And one small parameter was kind of blue instead of green. It doesn't matter. And then the same, it says positive or negative, so opportunities are the same. If we can save $5 million, stop everything, do it. If you can save 20K, don't bother. It doesn't really matter. Okay? So for this project, this is how we would define our terms high, medium, and low. Is this looking okay? Is this sort of vaguely familiar? You recognise all these things? Good. Okay, so then what we do is we use those to actually define how much risk is too much risk on our project. Okay, who's going to do that? What's the right answer? Who has the authority to define on my project how much risk is how much threat is intolerable and how much opportunity is essential and what level we don't care about? Can we let the chief engineer do that? Can we let our risk champion do that? Is it the project manager's job? What do you think? Sponsor, exactly. It's the project sponsor who should do this, talking to other key stakeholders, obviously, business owners and maybe clients and so on. And this is where we define our risk appetite. This is how much risk we want to take on this project. Sponsor owns the objectives, or the business owner, whatever you call them. They're the ones who should do it. Do project sponsors define risk appetite on your project? No, very, very rarely. So what are we going to do if we're the project manager, we want to know how much risk is too much risk on our projects, and the project sponsor won't tell us? What would you do? You would do it, wouldn't you? Yeah. Project manager has to do it, as usual. We do somebody else's job for them, and you write out a set of scales. You say, well, this looks about right to me. Excuse me, boss, sign here. And she says, I'm not signing there. That's way too much. And then she'll adjust them and then hopefully agree or not. So at least we can start the discussion, as you say, with a straw man. So it is the project sponsor's role to define what those thresholds are. We might have to help them along as the project manager. And then how do we tell people, how do you know what those levels are? They should be defined in the risk management plan, or the contract, or the charter, or the business case, or the statement of work, or something like that. Do you have those thresholds defined in your project charter or statement of work? Some do. Sometimes we use sort of company standards. Often we don't. What are we going to do? What we do is the same thing. The project manager writes it down, goes to the sponsor and says, is this what you meant? So on my project, is this right? And then you get it signed off. So, we do need to have these things, otherwise we can't start to manage risk on our projects because we have no idea how much is unacceptable. And then if it's not given to us by the sponsor in the risk management plan or the project charter, we've got to do it. But we can't progress without it. Okay, so we've got these definitions of high, medium, and low. Now what we want to do is to say how much risk is too much risk. Whoops. So what we're saying is that once we know what red, yellow, and green are, and we've agreed what that means for this project, then we measure the risks that we've got and we plot them on our probability impact matrix and they become red, yellow, or green risks, we know that our project is too risky if we have too many red risks. How many is that then? When I first started doing this in 1984, I used to write these risk reports, and it said, on this project we have 9 red risks, 12 amber risks or yellow risks, and 23 green risks, and so this project is medium risk. And that last bit, I completely made it up. I had no idea whether 9, 23 and 60 was good, bad or indifferent. How do you interpret it? It's subjective. It kind of feels, that's not good enough, is it? So how do you know if you're obese or overweight? Do we have anything measurable? Of course we do. Not just weight, because obviously you could be very, very tall or like me not so very tall. So we have another measure of obesity which is related not just to your weight, but your weight and your size. We call it BMI, the body mass index. And so you can measure your body mass index, and there's calculators that will help you do it online. And if it's equal or greater than 30, you're obese. So 20 to 25 is kind of normal, 25 to 30 is overweight, above 30 is defined as obesity. So we know, there's no doubt about it, you can measure something, do a calculation, and the answer is yes or no. And then if you're more than 40, you're morbidly obese, and you've got real medical problems. So would it be nice if we had some kind of BMI for risk? So what could we measure, that measure of risk exposure, how much risk we've actually got to decide if it's too much? Is there anything that we can quantify? Well, there is something that some people suggest, and it's this thing called expected monetary value. If you come across this, heard about this, EMV? And expected monetary value is calculated by taking the cost impact of your risk and multiplying it by the probability. So you have a kind of weighted impact. Then for each risk, you add all of those up and then see if it's too big. If there's some predetermined threshold value, if you're over that, then you've got too much risk. So that's how some people think about assessing the overall riskiness of their project. Is that a good idea? Well, there are some real problems with expected monetary value. You will find that EMV is not in the PMBOK guide. It's actually only in one place, and that's for evaluating decision trees, but that's a special case. It used to be there, 1996, in the 2000 edition, we cut it. And people are going, you can't cut that. How are we going to quantify risks? Exactly. How are you? That's an important question, but not like this. Why? Well, first of all, it's probability times cost impact. Not all risks have cost impact. So what are you going to multiply it by? Days? Reputation effect? What? Okay, so maybe we can translate some of our delays into dollars or pounds and kind of get a cost equivalent. But you can't do that for safety or for reputation or for regulatory compliance. It doesn't always work like that. And then the problem is, what do we do with these? It's hardly ever going to happen, but it's a really big one. And you multiply these together and you get some really weird numbers. A 1% chance of $1 billion impact, and you get some number in the middle that is completely meaningless because the risk is either going to be 0 or $1 billion, and you've calculated it out at some numbers of thousands, which is no use to anybody. And finally, when we do this probability times cost, the danger is we think it's money. We think that these are actual real dollars when they're not. There's some fake non-currency called probability dollars, which doesn't exist. And so what some people think is, well, we multiply these together, add them up, and that is our contingency amount, and we'll put that in the budget. That is a disaster. It really, because it's never going to be right. It usually underestimates, and the maths behind this will tell you it's a really bad thing to do, which is why it's not in the PMBOK guide. Okay? So we can't use expected monetary value. I'm sorry. If that's what you use, please don't. Please stop doing it. And if it's in your procedure, try and get your procedure changed, because it's just not going to help you. So what can we do? Is there anything else we can do to measure the weight of risk in our projects to know whether we've got too much or too little? We could do something with those red, yellow and greens if only red was a number, or yellow was a number and green was a number, and we could kind of do something with those. There is a way of turning red, yellow and green into numbers. This is also in the PMBOK guide. It's called the PI, the Probability Impact Score. What you do is you take each point on your scale, high, medium, low, and you give it a number value. And then you multiply those numbers together to get a non-dimensional score. So here's an example. This is the one that comes from the PMBOK guide. I developed this with some colleagues in about 1995. It's quite robust. There are lots of reasons why these numbers are in these boxes and not any other numbers. Some people go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you have a problem because 4 times 3 is the same as 3 times 4, and is it really linear, and so on. So there's good reasons why these numbers are here, which I can explain to you if you're really interested. But what this says is, if we've got a low probability, high impact risk, let's give that a score of that times that, 0.3 times 0.4, 0.12, and we can use that number as an indication of how big the risk is. And if we did that, here's an example, if we plot that into this probability impact matrix, so here are the numbers for probability 0.13579 and impact across here, multiply them out, rounded to 2 figures just for making it look clean. And now we can say, actually we've got numbers associated with the red zone. Anything above 0.2 is red. Anything below 0.08 is green, the yellows are in between. And then we can say that actually we've got a score for a risk which is a low probability of a very high impact. It's 0.24. Now it's not 0.24 of anything. You can't multiply that by anything and get days or dollars. It's just a number which is bigger than that number and smaller than that number. So it's a relative prioritization number, a relative ranking number, but it's expressing something to do with how likely it is and how big it could be. And it's called a PI score. Now, why is that useful? It's useful because it doesn't matter whether your impact is on time, cost, performance, schedule, reputation, compliance, anything. We're going to get the same product for a low, very high, 0.12 as we would, 0.24 as we would for any other low, very high combination. We're normalizing, we're taking out the difference between time and cost or performance or anything else, so we can actually add up different impact types in a common, quotes, currency. But of course it's not a currency. It helps us to define red, yellow and green in a sensible way. So on a normal project, you would find the red zone is defined as PI is greater than 0.2. But you could say, let's make it greater than 0.3, then we'll be taking more risk because the red zone shrinks. Or let's make red greater than 0.1, then the red zone grows, and then we're taking less risk. So you can actually do that in a sensible way. It's just a number, so there's no danger of confusing PI score with real dollars or real days. So we're not going to add up PI score and get contingency. We're just going to get a number, but that number is quite useful because we can actually do metrics and trend analysis with that number. So we could actually calculate the total PI score and compare that with a threshold that we define in advance. So this is like the weight of the risk, defined in sort of what we might call neutral units. Does that make sense? This is all still PMBOK. This is nothing advanced here. This is just PMBOK, right? But this is why we do it this way. Okay, let me move on. So here we can define too much risk using the PI scores and the PI matrix with defined scales. So you could now know if your project was too risky or not, because you've already got a PI matrix with some kind of defined red, yellow, green zones. You've got a set of risks that you've scored. You could actually apply this scoring system or something like it and turn it into numbers and add it up and see if it's bigger or smaller than a number which is normal for this type of project. You could do that. And then you can define if your project is too risky or not. You could do that. Nod, David, yes. All right, what are you going to do if you do it and your project is too risky? If you find that you're consistently breaching your safety thresholds or your performance thresholds or your productivity thresholds or your delivery dates are always late or you're always overspending, and if you've got loads of red risks and the score is above the threshold, what are you going to do about it? Well, let's go back to our analogy. Let's think about physical obesity. If you discover that your BMI is creeping up and you suddenly think, oh gosh, 28, 29, I better do something about this, what can you do? There are two things you can do. There's a short-term approach and there's a long-term approach. Short-term, lose weight. Long-term, change your habits. And we have similar things to losing weight and changing habits in the way that we manage risk on risky projects. So what do we mean by these things? Short-term, we're de-risking the projects to get our risk exposure down below that level, that threshold, which is too much risk. But long term, we've got to make sure that we have more balance in the way that we take risk on in the first place. Because otherwise you get that yo-yo effect, which a lot of dieters are very familiar with. You know, you diet, you lose weight, you relax, you put it all back on again. And that can happen on our projects too. So what do we mean by short-term de-risking the project? Well, first of all, we need to know, how much risk is too much, and then we set a goal weight, a level of risk exposure that we're aiming for. And of course, that's going to be different. Mine will be different from yours. 70 kilos works for me, it won't work for you. And then we need to know that's when you stop. You don't lose weight, keep losing weight, you'll die. You have to say, now I'm okay, I can stop here. This is an appropriate weight, an appropriate level of risk for this project. So that's defining when we stop having to work hard to reduce risk on our projects. Then what can we do? Well, we want to reduce the risk exposure, and we have a process for that. We have a way of minimizing threats and maximizing opportunities by targeting those red risks. We have standard strategies. We have avoid, transfer, reduce, and accept for threats, exploit, share, enhance, and accept for opportunities. We know how to do that. That will reduce our risk exposure, right? Easy peasy. There's another way to actually change the risk exposure on our project, which is a bit more radical than just dealing with individual risks, and that is to change scope. We could actually de-risk the project by finding the riskiest parts and just not doing them. If we've got the possibility of doing that, we could negotiate a contract change or a scope change. We could split ourselves into sub-projects and then do some kind of prototyping or incremental development to reduce the overall riskiness of the project, or adopt an agile development approach instead of a waterfall. We could take risky elements of the project and subcontract them to people who can manage that risk better than us. So there are things we can do kind of not through the risk process, but through our general project management to reduce risk on the project. And a combination of specifically targeting big risks and looking at the overall risk exposure of the project can get us down to within that kind of goal weight. So there are good things we can do in the short term to make sure that we stay within that level of risk exposure. There is an important thing to say, and it's true when we're trying to lose weight, you can't lose weight overnight, or you can't do it in a week. It will take a period of time. And the same is true when you have a risky project. It will take time to get your risk exposure to an acceptable level. So don't expect it to happen today or tomorrow. There is a process to go through, but it's short term. And what you have to do when you're dieting is you have to look after your general health. The same is true with dealing with risk obesity. We've got to make sure that our project stays reasonably healthy. And so things like exercise and communication, friendships, and not getting depressed, and there are equivalents in project management. So making sure our project management discipline is tight and effective, we're managing our relationships, keeping our team on side, and so on. So there's lots that we can do in the short term. Long term, change our habits. What does that mean? We need to make sure that we take on the right kinds of risks. Is your risk diet balanced? Are you taking enough opportunities? Do you have enough greens? Do you have enough vitamin B and all of those good things, enough oily fish? Well, opportunities are really good for us because they're ways of saving time, saving money, enhancing performance, improving the way that we deal with our projects. So we should be actively pursuing opportunities through the risk process. You know that. But are we doing it? Are we managing risks effectively across all different types of risks? So are we focusing on technical risks and forgetting commercial risks? Do we ever think about risks external to our project and how they could affect us? We need to change our diet of the risks that we're aware of and manage. And then in terms of risk appetite and taking on risk, we need to understand that. And at key points, we need to be asking the question, should we be actually taking more risk? Are we getting underfed, underweight? Should we be taking risk now or later? When is the right time to take on additional risk in our projects? And are we taking, again, the right balance, the right breadth of risks to create benefits for our projects? So what does this mean? This means that when we come to a project decision that involves change, we ask the question, how does this change impact our risk exposure? So you do a risk impact analysis on all key changes. Change in strategy, new tactics for execution, scope change, and changes in the context. And if we ask those questions habitually and build in those sorts of questions into the way that we run the project, then we'll change over time our habits for risk-taking on the project. Okay, now just a couple more things to say about risk health as we wrap up. I think I've got 3 more slides. The World Health Organization, in its charter, which was written in 1948, says that health is defined as complete physical, mental and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease, 1946. So it's not enough just to cure TB, to make sure we don't have polio and measles and those sort of things. That health is something positive. It's about well-being. And the same is true for risk. Risk health is not just getting rid of the bad things, finding these ailments like risk obesity and some of the others, and getting rid of them. Risk health is something much more positive. It involves having an effective capability to manage risk with good processes and growing in our ability to manage risk of all types, both within the project and within the organisation. So being healthy is more than just tackling these problem areas. And I'd like to suggest 5 ways that we can stay risk healthy, just as headlines. We're not going to talk about them in any detail just now because obviously time has run away. But here are 5 things that we could think about longer term to make sure that our organisation or our projects stay risk healthy, in other words, well-being. Perhaps the most important thing is culture, risk culture. How do we think about risk? What do we believe about risk? How do we talk about risk? What are our basic values when it comes to risk? Is risk always and only bad and we need to make sure we eliminate it from all our projects? Anyone who's got risk is a weakling, is unprofessional, is a wimp. Real men take risk and have the scars to prove it. Or is it something a bit more nuanced and mature than that? So culture is really important and tone from the top. And to get the right risk culture, we need risk leadership. Not risk management, but risk leadership. Senior people in the organisation who set the vision. You say, we're going this way. This is why risk management is important in our organisation. I'm doing it, I want you to do it. It will be rewarded and recognised. So there's leadership in the organisation for risk management. And then we need to make sure that we grow, so we're continually getting better in our risk management capability by reviewing our processes, by training our people, by learning new things and implementing new approaches, not just doing the same old and getting stale. And then making sure that we learn intentionally, we actually look at what we're doing, what went well, what didn't go well, not just post-project reviews, but all the time, and specifically having risk-based lessons to be learned. And finally, making sure that we keep momentum. You often find with risk management in projects and organisations, it's kind of flavour of the month, or there's an initiative to improve risk management that lasts for 6 months. Done that, move on to something else, and then we kind of peak and we fall away. It's important, it's really important to project and business success to make sure we keep improving, keep developing, keep pushing, because risk is always there. And if you relax for a moment, it'll come and get you. And if we take these sorts of things, build them into our general way we think about risk, way we approach risk in our organisations, we'll be much more robust, much more healthy, and able to kick off some of those ailments which trouble us. Now, I've mentioned about a number of ailments in risk health. Here's just an ad for the book, just to say that covers these sort of 10 areas. I've got it over here you can have a look at. I'd recommend you think about taking a look at that, because we've got other things like risk blindness. We don't have risk at all. Or risk myopia, short-sighted. All we think about is risks here. Or risk depression. All you think about is bad things. We forget about the opportunities, and so on. So there's a number of interesting ways into thinking about risk problems that are described in the book here, and you might like to have a look at it. Okay, so finally, risk obesity is important. It's important because risk-obese projects take on too much risk with uncontrolled risk appetite, which can be terminal for the project. And if it's a really strategic project, it could be terminal for the organisation. But we can do something about it. First, we need to know, how do we know if we've got too much risk? We use the scale, the matrix with defined scales to define that. Then we can use the scoring system to decide how much risk we've got, compare the two, and manage to that. And then we've got 2 ways of approaching it. If we find our project is too risky, we can go for short-term de-risking by tackling individual risks using the explicit risk management process, and if necessary, changing the scope and approach and strategy of the project in the way that we manage the project itself, the project strategy, and then longer term, thinking about our risk-taking habits and focusing on risk health, the broader picture. So I think I'll stop there. I hope you found that interesting. Franco said 2:30 It's just about past. So the big question now, having talked about this, is for you to actually understand the question. Is your project risk obese? But there's a follow-on question. If it is, what are you going to do about it? And hopefully some of the things we've talked about, which start in basic PMBOK processes, basic risk management, and with some small refinements, are actually focusing on the things that matter. This is easy to do and really important. And the question is, are you going to do it? So let me finish there, and I think we've got some time, 10 minutes for questions maybe? Yes.
So first of all,
Thank you. Well, as a world premiere, I enjoyed that, but I hope you did too. It'll be better next time, but I'm sharing this at the PMI Global Congress in Orlando next month, so this was my kind of warm-up act. So, we're recording this, so I think we need to speak the questions into the microphone.
Yes, we have to speak. Any question?
Would you say who you are and where you're from, just for the mic?
Hi, David. I'm Martin Thorpe from CGI. Thank you very much for a good talk. My question's around the PI score in terms of defining a score against which you measure whether your project is obese or not. In my mind, you've still got, somebody's got to decide how many high risks, total score. Is that correct? And is there a process for doing that as well that you've defined?
Yes, somebody has to define it, and this is what we said, it's the sponsor's role. If the sponsor doesn't do that, then the project manager needs to help him or her to do that with some kind of coaching or straw man. And it will be a number. It needs to be a number because it has to be measurable, and it needs to be not just kind of around here somewhere. Now, there's two ways of knowing. One, and the best way, is really previous experience, but obviously if you're starting, you haven't got any previous experience. But if you've run lots of projects like this, you will know on your project 50 is the number, or 55 or 60, because we've been monitoring it, and we found that when our risk exposure or the PI score grew above 50, we were in real trouble and we couldn't cope with the amount of risk, and below that we were okay. So previous experience is always the guide, and if we've done it before, then we'll know how to do it again. And there are sort of guidelines. But I think it is difficult. And this will be the challenge to say, well, what do we mean by this? The PMI used to have SIGs. Do you remember SIGs? Before we had communities of practice, we had SIGs, specific interest groups. There was a metrics SIG. And I wrote a paper for the metrics SIG saying, how do you measure risk exposure? I guess it was about 96 or something like that. The paper's available on my website, on the RiskDoctor website, and it's free to download. You don't have to sign in or anything. And there we talk about 6 different metrics around this idea of total PI score and how you define it. So it can be done. There are techniques for doing it. If you've got previous experience, use that. Now, actually, we do have previous experience. It's just that it's not always measured in this way. So, of course, you can go and back measure. You can do a retrospective scoring of the risk register through your last 5 projects and score the risk register at each of your updates, say each monthly or quarterly update, and see how that PI score varied and whether risks were under control or not. And then you can actually begin to get some data even though you didn't gather the data at the time. So it's easy to backfit and create historical data if you've got previous risk registers. It's a great question. Thank you.
Jeff Porter, recently retired, so nobody. Supplementary to that question, we talked about risks having to reputation, to cost, to schedule. Are you taking the risk score for each of those and adding them together?
Yes.
You are.
Oh, well, sorry, that's a good question.
Because it may be a smaller impact in, say, for cost than it is for schedule.
Right, okay, so if you have one risk which has more than one impact, so you can have something that might or might not occur. If it occurs, has a small impact on time, big impact on cost, medium impact on performance. So is that a bigger or smaller risk than a risk which just has a low probability of happening and a big impact on cost? And the answer, of course, is yes, because if it impacts more than one objective, then the risk is bigger, heavier, if you like. So for that reason, I would use the PI score for each of those impact types when we're measuring the total. Add them up, yes. It's purely additive. You don't want to do any, sort of crypto maths that nobody understands. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other question?
Please.
Mike Valman from NE. Mike Valman from NE.
Thank you.
How does well, everything you've explained this evening is familiar. Quite often our matrices are more subjective, or they have subjective descriptions rather than just colours. What about when we do cost risk analysis and we start using Monte Carlo methods, and we often will take our risk register and we'll choose the top 10 or the top 20 risks, and we'll use the cost plus or minus, and then we'll do Monte Carlo analysis. And I mean, how do you think that sits in the scheme of things compared to what you've been explaining this evening?
That's great, thank you, Mike.
And we also do schedule risk analysis the same way.
Yes. I mean, I start with qualitative with the PI matrix because everybody will do that. And, you know, some industries don't use Monte Carlo simulation at all. But exactly the same principles apply. So in our risk models, we can set, for example, probability percentiles, confidence percentiles, to say if we don't have, let's say, 65% chance of hitting our target, then that's red. And if we're, let's say, 50 to 65, that's yellow, and if it's below 50, that's green, or the other way around. So we can set our red, yellow, and green, and I presented a paper at last year's PMI Congress, which actually shows how to do that. So certainly you can use your quantitative analysis outputs to define red, yellow, and green against your S-curves in a different way. But I must just comment on picking your top 10 risks and including those in the model. Why would you only use the top 10? You know, and if you've got 30 risks that are all small and they all affect the same package of work, that package of work is exposed. Or if they all hit the critical path, you know, we really need to include all our risks in the risk model, and we need to make sure that we separate risks from estimating uncertainty. So estimating uncertainty is where you plan to do something, and that task might take longer or shorter than you plan, or might cost more or less than you plan. Productivity could be higher or lower. The trial might take this many days or that many days. That's estimating uncertainty. Then you've got risks, which are things that are not in the plan, that might or might not happen. And we need to model them separately, and they're all important. And we need to put correlation into our model. So if this risk happens, it stops those risks happening. If that risk happens, it makes that one worse. And so, you know, risk modeling is very much more, I mean, it's really important, but it's more than just taking your top 10 risks and dropping them into the plan, pressing the big red simulate button and seeing what happens. I do hope you don't do that. But certainly, you know, you can put zones on your S-curve to define red, yellow, and green in exactly the same way. You get a heat map for your S-curves in the same way that you do for your PI grid. Yeah. Please.
Anthony Quinney and I. You showed us a graph of projects which had succeeded, failed, or challenged. Is there any evidence to show that it was risk management, poor, good, or otherwise, why they succeeded, failed, or challenged? Because I jumped to the conclusion that they failed because of poor risk management, but of course that was a wrong conclusion.
It was yes. It's a very complex question. You know, why do projects fail? And certainly the Standish group have done some analysis. They've got 10 success factors and 10 failure factors. If you read the chaos reports, the National Audit Office that looks at major projects, UK government projects, has done similar things and has got what they call the gold standard, which I think is 5 or 6 critical success factors and 5 or 6 critical failure factors. And risk management is clearly one of those on both sides. So the idea of a critical success factor is that if you have it, you'll succeed. If you don't have it, you'll fail. That's why it's critical. And risk management, effective risk management, is one of those. So it's one of. I mean, other things are to do with effective sponsorship, with good communication, with clear scope, you know, the basic things, really. So it's hard to tease out just risk management and say this was the contribution. There's actually 2 good data sets that I'm familiar with. One is from the MOD, and one is from a major oil company that I can tell you about off the recording. And what they've done is you can isolate the effect of risk management because they introduced risk management at a particular point in time. So what we can say for the MOD is up until 1983, we can look at project performance. Then after 1983, when formal risk management was introduced, we can look at project performance after that. And if there's a change, it's probably due to risk management. And the same with this organisation, this oil company. which introduce risk management at a particular point in time, and you can track changes in project performance. So just as an illustration, and these are not real numbers, but they could be, if we took on this flip chart actual divided by estimated project outturn, we can do it in days or dollars, then 1 means you're completely on plan, right? So what actually happened is what you thought would happen. And so what we find is that project distributions at a particular point in time are like this, and then you've got this, right? So there are a few outliers. And that was quite common for both of these organisations, the MOD. Huge variation, up to 10 times project and down to about 0.2 times the project budget or timeline. Massive variability. Partly due to poor risk management, actually probably equally due to poor original planning. You know, the plan was unachievable in the first place. Anyway, if we say here is the point where we introduce formal risk management, what happened was this. And you could actually see at this point the variability changed. And we got down, sorry, it wasn't quite that good, we got down to about 2, plus 2, and about 0.8. So the variability after, and this was maintained. And so you can actually see all of the projects fall into this, you know, with occasionally stuff happens. But there's real data for both of those organisations. And you could do something similar. Now, what's interesting is that maturity, risk management capability, once you've got it,